There is no evidence that on average, people who are childless, and also like especially those who are child-free, that they would in any way regret their decision. There's no evidence supporting this.
Hello and welcome to the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. And today we are going to get research focused because you know what? There is so much discussion about who fares better when it comes to mental health, well-being, fulfillment, loneliness. We, of course, have a lot of ideas specifically about child-free folks and the fact that if you don't have kids, life's going to be miserable. You're going to regret it. You're going to be lonely when you're old. And I thought, what actually is research and empirical evidence showing us around this decision? I came across the perfect guest to talk to about this. I recently came across one of her latest studies. This is none other than Dr. Laura Buchinger of Germany. She is here in our beautiful city of Berlin, and she's going to be talking to us about some of these questions about who fares better. Of course, it's not a competition, but how are we doing when it comes to mental, emotional, physical well-being in terms of having or not having children? So a little bit about today's guest. Dr. Laura Buchinger is a lifespan psychologist exploring how personality, motivation, health, and well-being evolve throughout life. After earning an undergraduate degree from Chemnitz University of Technology in 2013, Laura completed a master's degree in clinical psychology at Freie Universität Berlin in 2016. She began her career as an organizational psychologist and consultant, focusing on occupational health and safety before transitioning back to academia just before the pandemic. In 2023, Dr. Buchinger earned a PhD in psychology from Freie Universität Berlin with a thesis titled Life Goals Across Adulthood and Old Age, Associations with Personality and Well-Being. Dr. Laura is now a post-doctoral researcher in developmental psychology at Humboldt-Universität in Berlin. Her research focuses on interindividual differences in personality traits, life goals, and values, and their effects on health and well-being across the lifespan. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Laura Buchinger. Dr. Laura Buchinger, I'm sorry, first of all, for my terrible German pronunciation. I should try that again.
It's okay.
Laura Buchinger. Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you for coming onto the podcast. I'm so glad that we've connected over the last couple of months, and I had actually seen your work come up. I get notifications from Google on all these terms like childless, child-free, motherhood. And one of your recent research studies projects came up, and I thought, I need to connect with this woman because there's really not a huge amount of research that's done on this decision, or let's say exploring the lives of parents versus those without kids. And so the fact that you are doing this work made me really excited to reach out. And then when we connected and we had so much to chat about, I'm really grateful for this connection, and especially grateful that you're on the podcast today. So maybe to kick things off, why don't you just tell us a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on your podcast. And I found it interesting that you said there's not that much research, because that's actually not true. But for some reason, people are not aware of this research, but we're going to talk about that later on, I guess.
Amazing.
So I'm Laura. I am 34 and live in Berlin. I've been here for 11 years, came here to do my master's degree in psychology and kind of stayed here. I have a cat and a partner. And I like being in the mountains, which is weird in Berlin, but I really liked your episode with Brooke Fröhlich. And I'm here because I'm a developmental psychologist with a focus on adulthood. So this means I study how people change throughout their lives with respect to mental health, to well-being, to personality. And I also study how they change around certain life events. So, for instance, childbirth, and also how things like parenthood influences how people change.
Amazing. Well, I want to say, first of all, I appreciate you calling me out on the fact that I incorrectly stated that there's not a huge amount of research. And Maybe it's because a lot of it doesn't necessarily make it into sort of like our mainstream media. I also am curious, do you think the fact that a lot of this isn't discussed, specifically where it pertains to this kids or child-free decision, do you think it's because certain ideas and stereotypes are so pervasive about what it means to have or not have kids? Like, I know I'm putting you on the spot a bit, but why do you think that there isn't an overall recognition that actually we've studied this and we can make some pretty clear conclusions about the lives of people with and without children?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe one reason is that there are folk theories that say, for instance, parenthood makes you happy.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to talk about that in more detail, but the large literature doesn't, I mean, to some degree it does, but it doesn't necessarily support that people without children and people with children are vastly different from one another regarding their life satisfaction, regarding their affective well-being. So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe this is becoming more important. Maybe we will see more coverage of this in the future.
Yeah. And I realize, again, I know I've kind of put you on the spot and it's probably speculation from both of our sides. I wonder how much of this is, aside from the topic we're discussing today, just related to the fact that maybe a lot of what we study in academia doesn't necessarily make it over to the mainstream, or it takes time to do that. So, okay, cool. So I want to talk about your most recent study, which, as mentioned, I had seen a press release about it and I thought, wow, this is fascinating. And from my side, I don't come across work in this area super often. So what was the study? Sort of what was the inspiration behind it? I'm hoping you can just give us sort of a top level sense of what it was about, this research.
Yeah. So maybe I'm going to start a little bit earlier. So during my PhD, I worked for the German socioeconomic panel. And this is one of the largest and I believe the longest running panel survey in Europe. So this means that since 1984, over 30,000 individuals and 15,000 households have been asked each year about all sorts of things. So their economic situation, their social networks, their careers, their health, really many, many things, and also their life goals. And we also have information about whether they have children or not, whether they become parents or not. So we have these really rich longitudinal data where we can track people's lives in a way. And one of the questions that was asked repeatedly was, so different things are important to different people. How important are these things to you right now? And then a happy relationship or marriage, owning a house, career success, but also to have children. And when I started my PhD, I think I was kind of myself looking for a life goal. I had just quit a job in consulting, so I didn't go straight into academia, but I was kind of myself looking for what is my life goal. And then I started doing research about life goals. And in my first study where I looked at how these different life goals change across the lifespan, I noticed that having children was very a lot was going on with this particular goal. A lot of gender effects were going on with this particular goal. And maybe I can just summarize briefly the three things.
Yeah, I'd be curious what those findings were. That's probably a good way to set this up. Yeah.
The first thing I noted was that people who end up becoming parents, for them, this one goal becomes the most important thing. Everything else drops thereafter. And second interesting finding was that as early as age 18, we saw differences in how important it is to have children between those women who would later become mothers, so much later would become mothers, and those who wouldn't, so as early as age 18. And that concerned this goal to have children, but also career success. So women who would later become mothers perceived having children as significantly more important, and career success as significantly less important as early as 18. And we didn't see these differences in men. The last interesting thing, that struck me kind of was the importance of having children dropped for those women who did not end up having them. So somewhere in the 30s for the women, or like mid-late 30s, the importance of having children dropped significantly. This became almost the least important goal, whereas for men we did not observe this. So it just stayed at the same level, or even increased a little bit. So I thought, okay, a lot is going on here, and there are psychological theories, developmental theories saying, well, it is good, and it's good for well-being to let go of goals that are very difficult or impossible to attain. So that's adaptive. It's good that we let go of goals. And I thought, well, but what about these people for whom it was never that important in the first place? So what about the women who, in early adulthood, didn't think that that parenthood or motherhood is important? How is their well-being affected in some way? And that kind of led to this study that you found the press release about, where I was interested in how important we perceive having children when we are early adults, so in our 20s. Does that influence the development of our well-being later in life, so throughout our 30s, 40s, and 50s, contingent on whether we actually become parents or not? That was the main question for this study.
Okay, super interesting. And so I just want to highlight a couple things there. It sounds like then for both studies, you were using what I guess is referred to as longitudinal data, correct? So data over a long period of time, which my understanding is that not super commonplace in other studies that have been done? In this field, I should clarify.
Yeah. So there is a lot or more research on the couple of years before and after the transition to parenthood. So for instance, 3 years prior to making the transition, and then 3 years after. But in our study, we the average participation was 25 years. So that's really long. So even in this, so I used the German socioeconomic panel, which I mentioned earlier. I used these data to select this the sample, which ended up not being very big for a substandard. So they were 562 people in the sample who we had data on up to 30 years, on average 25 years, and that is that's not common. That's quite rare that you have this extensive longitudinal data. But there obviously, there is research just a couple of years before and after the transition to parenthood, but that doesn't allow any conclusions about effects later on in life.
Yeah. No, I mean, my understanding was that makes this definitely unique. And so the data then was looking at people up until 60 years of age. Is that okay? Yeah. And of course, I have some questions later, because I'm like, I think a lot of people, when they think about this decision and or, what their circumstances end up being, whether having or not having kids, they think about even later in life. But of course, 25, 30 years is a long time to look at people. And I do, sorry, go ahead, Laura.
No, I just wanted to say that I didn't on purpose stop at 60. It was not possible, because the first time these life goals were assessed was in 1990. So people had to be in their 20s in 1990, and a lot of these people just haven't gotten that old. You
couldn't go in the future to get the data. Okay. Darn. No, I mean, it's still obviously incredible to look at people over that much span of life. And so this was in Germany. It was men and women. Okay. And I want to talk about some of those gender differences that you highlighted, as well as some of the others. But tell me, first of all, what was your sort of hypothesis in wanting to do this study? What were you hoping to discover? What kind of differences do you think you'd find between people, specifically as it pertains to having and not having kids?
So maybe when I started reading the literature, my at the time naive and probably heavily influenced through socialization and norms, was that I would find in the literature that parents probably do a little bit better than people without children. But I've found in the literature very fast that this is not the case. I mean, there are some differences depending on the outcome you're looking at. So there are different aspects to psychosocial well-being and mental health. And in some parents do better, in others, people without children do better, and then in some, there are largely no differences, cancel each other out maybe. So we actually, when we formulated the hypotheses, I actually thought, well, I'm actually expecting that we probably don't find anything, that there are probably no differences. But then one of my co-authors said, well, we can't have like an undirected hypothesis. We should have a directed hypothesis. So why aren't we just really bold and say, well, we expect that people without children do better?
Okay.
And that was the hypothesis or the hypotheses we pre-registered. So, you formulate your hypothesis before you start working with the data, and that's what we pre-registered. We said, well, we expect that people without children do better. And in the review process, a lot of reviewers actually said, why did you expect that? And we had to argue, so, well, look at the literature. Literature.
Yeah. Okay. So 2 questions on that. When you say look at the literature, historically, is that what we've seen, collectively, we research that's been done, that people without kids fare better on different, and I realize now I've got all these layers of questions, but you talk about measuring or looking at psychosocial well-being. So maybe you can just share, let's start with that. Maybe you can just kind of share, when we talk about well-being, what different facets of well-being are we looking at? Because well-being is, what does that mean?
I won't, I'll just talk about the ones that we looked at in the study, if that is.
Yeah, for sure. Of course.
Because
it's probably
so many.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah. So we looked at 8 different outcomes. One was, it's called the short form 12, which is like the mental health subscale of a really established instrument to assess mental health related quality of life. And it includes questions about anxiety and depressive symptoms, questions about limitations people experience due to emotional problems, and also fatigue and social functioning. So this was like one measure, the result of this instrument. And then that was sort of the mental health aspect. And for well-being, we looked at subjective, or sometimes called hedonic well-being, which has maybe this is too much into detail, I don't know, but it has a cognitive evaluative component, and that's usually assessed through how we evaluate our current life situation with an ideal life situation. And that's often asked as how satisfied are you with your life, or how satisfied are you with different life domains. And we included general life satisfaction, satisfaction with family life, satisfaction with health, and satisfaction with work. And then there's an affective component of this subjective hedonic well-being, and that is commonly assessed as how frequently are you experiencing positive emotions, that would be positive affect, and how frequently are you experiencing, and then a number of, so there, people are not asked how often are you experiencing positive emotions, but how often are you feeling joy, how are you feeling happy, and for the negative emotions, how often in the last 2 years have you felt sad and angry. So those 2 aspects we included, and then we also included a measure of loneliness, so how often people felt lonely. Those were the things we looked at in this particular study.
Okay, Laura has your attention now when she said loneliness, because this is a big trigger for a lot of people making this decision. Will I be lonely? Okay, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just want to point that out. Stay tuned, folks.
It's important, yeah.
Okay, and so those were some of the different areas then that you explored, I think all of which really tie to questions that many of us who are on the fence have asked or are asking ourselves. You mentioned when you had this hypothesis, you said, sort of based on the research, we think that we'll find that people without kids have higher or greater levels of well-being, based on those areas you looked at. Is that what had been shown to date? And if so, can you tell us just very briefly about that, what they've seen?
I think the literature says very clearly, no, there are no huge differences overall. So, but people rarely formulate this as a hypothesis in research, that there are no differences.
Because otherwise, why are you researching, basically?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. But there, there are differences in, regarding life satisfaction, for instance, most studies find no differences. But regarding affective well-being, most studies, including my own, did find differences.
Okay.
So should I already...
Well, ... We'll get to that in just a minute. Okay.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to touch on, and I'm sorry, I'm like teasing this study so much because I know people are here for the results, but when you said there was like kind of, maybe a bit of internal pushback or like, why is that your hypothesis? Did you notice, and I'm not sure if you can think about this now or if this is something you noticed at the time, a difference between people who were parents and not parents and what they thought about that hypothesis?
Within my team?
Either within your team or within the panel. You mentioned, I think, a panel of people that you brought this to. I don't know if you knew their specific situations.
So the peer review process is anonymous, so I don't know if they were parents. Sometimes you can guess. Sometimes you also get comments. Oh, I bet this reviewer doesn't have kids or has kids. I've had that. Yeah. But within my team, regarding the hypothesis, actually not so much. But I think also because we are researchers and should be neutral. We are two equal parts. Of one person, I'm not sure if they have kids, but the other, like three, we have three parents in the team, and the only discussion that we had was quite like but we had one discussion, and that concerned using the term child-free, because two of the three parents were very reluctant to use this because they thought, this can be understood as children are generally something that they're a burden that you should be free from, and they were reluctant at first at using this, but we ended up using the term, and the third parent was totally fine with using it.
Yeah. It's interesting with that term. And I think you and I had chatted about this before. It's only very recently, and I've been doing this work and kind of delving into this kids or child-free question for the last few years, but only recently have I heard people articulate, when we think about sugar-free, fat-free, the implication being the thing we're free from is bad. And I thought, oh, okay, interesting. And we could have a whole other conversation about language, semantics, et cetera. But so that was a discussion point amongst the team. And I do want to clarify or just confirm, in this study, the people who ended up not having children, you didn't know if that was through choice or circumstance. Is that correct?
Yeah. No.
Okay. Okay. And so when we use child-free, it may not be in the term of like by choice, but just without children.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so like often in the paper, we also said just people with and without children, because you can also argue if you say childless, you're implying that they're lacking something.
Yeah, for sure.
And most of the time we try to just say people with and without children. But in the theoretical aspects of the paper and also in the discussion, we obviously referred to this to the research that is there. And also that needs to be done on distinguishing between people who are child-free by choice and those who are involuntarily child-free. Childless, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. So why don't we get into some of the key study results here that might interest our listeners? And perhaps we can start by looking at like mental health and well-being amongst those with and without children and what it was that you found.
Yeah. So as I said earlier, regarding the cognitive evaluative well-being, there were no differences across the investigated age span. There were at least regarding life satisfaction, satisfaction with work, and satisfaction with health. There were some very small, really very, very small differences, and only in the 30s regarding satisfaction with family life, in that people without children were a little less satisfied with their family life, but in the 40s, these were gone.
Interesting.
There were differences with regards to mental health, in that people without children had better mental health than parents, particularly in the 30s and early 40s. So then later on in life, again, these differences disappeared. But in the 30s and 40s, people without children had better mental health, and they also experienced less frequent negative emotions. But also less frequent positive emotions. So parents just seem to experience a lot of emotions, both positive and negative. And with regards to loneliness, we did find differences in that people without children experience a little higher people without children experience a little more loneliness. However, this does only concern men. So I think we're going to talk about gender differences later. But this effect in loneliness was fully driven by men. So fathers are less lonely than men without children, but mothers and women without children are equally lonely.
So interesting. Yeah. And I know we'll talk a little more about gender differences in a second. And granted, I predominantly work with women, but of the men that I've coached and worked with, I don't think I've ever had a man say to me, I'm worried I'll be lonely when I'm old. And yet this is such a prevalent narrative from women that they worry about if they decide not to have kids.
But they are less lonely. Like the research, women are better at, this is not my own research, but there's a lot of research showing that women are better at cultivating social relationships outside of the family, and also later on in life. So, I think one important takeaway from my research, but also from other researchers, that if you are a woman who is on the fence and is leaning towards not having kids, and your main concern is being lonely, then I think you can drop this concern, because you can be lonely with children, you can be lonely without children. You should what you can do is invest in your friendships, invest in your community. Your children are not a guarantee that you won't be lonely later in life.
Absolutely. Yes, you're so clever. It's so true. No, I mean, it's what I say all the time. And yet you heard it here. I'm going to reiterate it again. If loneliness is a concern, there's no indication that you will be more lonely without having kids. And sort of putting words in your mouth, but what I'm hearing from you, which I think most people would agree to be true, loneliness is something that we all may grapple with, but having or not having kids won't make you immune to that.
Yeah, definitely.
Unless you're a man. ... Okay.
I mean, it's also good for men to. It's also very important and very good for men to investigate in their friendships and their communities, because research shows that men are not doing like as well in that regard as women on average, of course. And that single men are. This is a whole different line of research, like singlehood, which I'm also kind of interested in. And singlehood is really detrimental for older men, but single women tend to be quite fine after the 40s.
I've heard that. I think I've heard certain research has shown that single women, specifically later in life and without children, actually are, I think, one of the happiest, most fulfilled subgroups of people.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. There's one study from 2015 by, I forgot her first name, but the last name is Graham, and she looked at, I think, altogether 9,000 women, and it's included 1,000 that were 65 or older, and that group was the group with the largest difference in well-being and also in physical health between women who had children and those who didn't, and those who didn't had better physical health and better well-being.
Wow. Okay. I'm going to divorce my husband, and I've already chosen not to have kids. Laura's like, it's not my fault.
No, there are positive effects of being in a relationship, but
I'm teasing. It's mostly positive. I know that many or most of you are on the fence, but I certainly know there are those among you who are pretty close to choosing child-free or have made the decision but are still looking for some validation and support in your decision, who want to feel even more confident in this child-free path. I've created the Confidently Child-Free Support Series, and it starts already this week. We are going to be running for 6 months. We are going to have monthly sessions. We have a Slack community for child-free women. We're going to be talking about all kinds of different things, starting with what it is like and how to navigate the sense that you are somehow an outsider in life because you've chosen not to have kids. Some of the other topics we're going to be exploring are what happens when you're old as a child-free person, how you can cultivate new friendships, and also navigate those friendships you have with people who've chosen the parenthood path. There is lots of good stuff in store. So again, if the description fits, if you are someone who identifies as child-free, you are pretty close to clinching that child-free decision, I definitely encourage you to check out my Confidently Child-Free support series. You can buy tickets for each event individually. They are $45 each. And I also have an all-access pass, just like I do with the Kids or Child-Free support series, where you can get access to all 6 sessions for just $180. I will include the link to this latest support series. And again, if you are on the fence, we do have our Kids or Child-Free support series. So now 2 support series. We've got monthly sessions for each on different topics, either pertaining to being on the fence or for those of you who have chosen and are looking to cultivate more confidence and more joy in your child-free life. Okay, and I'm curious, would you say, I mean, you sort of already mentioned that I think we talked a little bit about different life phases, for example, through the 30s or maybe early 40s, there's more ups and downs for people without kids, or with kids, pardon me. Would you say there's other phases in life where you see more pronounced differences amongst some of these measures of biopsychosocial well-being? What a mouthful.
In my study, it was mainly the 30s and 40s when differences in both directions occurred. And I think one explanation for this is that this is just a really stressful time in life, maybe for a lot of people. One author calls this the career and care crunch. So during this time, you don't only have high demands in the care domain. Like if you have children, they're still quite young, but you may also have aging parents that you need to care for. So just the demands in the care domain are high, and you're also still trying to become established in your career. So those demands are also really high. And for some people, this is just a very overwhelming time. And if you are one of those who has children, you're also kind of still maybe trying to adapt to the parent role, which is new, and you've never been a parent before. But I mean, also, if you look at, if you are within a context where everyone starts to have children and you don't, the other way around, you may also still have to adapt to your either your choice or the circumstance that you are not one of the parents. And then what we see is that these differences in both directions. So those areas where parents do better, and those areas that where people without children do better, these trajectories converge again somewhere in the 40s and 50s, because probably everyone has come to terms with whichever path they've taken.
Yeah. That is a good segue to a different question I wanted to ask you later, but I actually would like to talk about it now. And I think this pertains more to earlier research you've done, but when you talk about, they've come to terms with whatever path they've taken. Actually, I think it may have been in this study. You can let me know what study it was in, but was it not seen or shown that depending on whether people held having children as a big life goal, dependent upon whether or not they held on to that goal, depending if they didn't have kids and they held on to this as a goal, that actually influenced well-being and satisfaction. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because I think that's something really important for people to, and we'll talk about why, but to kind of grasp onto.
Yeah. So that was this current study where we expected, so this was also one of our hypotheses, that people for whom having children was very important in their 20s, and then they didn't end up having children, that they would do worse with regards to well-being and mental health compared to people who for whom having children was never that important in the first place, and who didn't end up having kids. And we found this effect, but only in women. So no such effect in men. But this is important. So these women for whom having children was very important, but they didn't end up becoming mothers, their mental health was still comparable, and at large phases of the life of the investigated age span better than the mental health of mothers. So it's not that they had super low mental health. It was still comparable to mothers. It was just that the mental health of the women for whom having children was never that important in the first place, and who didn't have children, that their mental health was higher.
Yeah.
And then we also checked if like adapting to this fact, so kind of perceiving having kids as less and less important, if that changed something. So if people managed to let go of this goal, if this positively influenced their well-being, and this is what we found.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And I think, I mean, a lot of what, I don't want to say the things I share are anecdotal, but of course, you know, to an extent, it's about my experience, what I see with my clients. And I know you and I have spoken about this, but it may help sort of distinguish or explain why we typically, and again, maybe I feel like this hasn't been studied a lot. I would love for you to tell me if it has, but when we talk about not parental regret, let's say being childless, child-free regret amongst those without kids, there seems to be in the literature or from the research that's been done, little indication that people who've chosen not to have kids have regrets around that. And I wonder about how much of it is because if that wasn't a goal of yours, there's probably not going to be this like emotional sort of disharmony or pain or what have you. On the flip side, we do sometimes see that, you know, amongst those where it's really important, they're unable to have children through whatever circumstance, that of course can be very painful. And again, this is sort of anecdotal, but from what I've seen amongst the, we can call it childless community, those people who, as you put it so nicely, are able to disengage from that goal, not to say they don't grieve that experience of loss or not having had a child or children, but to say, I'm now going to focus my life elsewhere. Some people even really embrace and embody this notion of a child-free life. They seem to fare well or better than those who really hold on to, I wasn't able to be a mother, I wasn't able to have children. I'm mentioning it because it seems to be confirmed in the research, but correct me if I'm wrong, if I've missed anything there.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I do want to share something actually that you said. I'm going to quote it back to you. It was in something I read. And it said, these results suggest that it is not childlessness per se that is associated with poorer mental health. Rather, what matters is how strongly the normative goal of parenthood has been internalized, especially for women. How easily one can let go of a goal depends in part on how strongly it is embedded in societal norms and on the availability of similarly attractive and socially accepted alternatives. This is where interventions come in by making diverse life concepts visible and by treating them as equal. Can you elaborate on that? And I think that also segues really nicely to gender differences, specifically amongst the pressures we may see and these sort of patriarchal norms we see for women around having kids.
I think that's one of the most important things the study shows, that, and what you said earlier, there is no evidence that on average, there are, of course, individual people who suffer greatly because they don't have children, and maybe also for a long time. But there are also a lot of parents who suffer greatly because they struggle with being a parent.
Yeah.
But there is no evidence that on average, people who are childless, and also especially those who are child-free, that they would in any way regret their decision. There's no evidence supporting this, but of course, motherhood is way more ingrained as a central point of the feminine identity, or I don't know how to say this, but then fatherhood is of the male identity. I was raised in West Germany, where it was not so, at the time when I was young, it was still quite common that there were, the Western German housewife was still present. It's changing, but I wasn't raised in East Germany, and I did not have very many female role models that were not somehow a mother.
I mean, I would echo that experience as well. And that's what I hear from so many of my clients is it is so normalized to, if you're a woman, be a mother. And it's tough for us to even imagine what is available if it's beyond what we know and what we've experienced. I'm interested. So looking at gender differences then, can you just share a little bit more in terms of what you uncovered with the study?
Yeah. So there are gender differences in the sense that the positive effects that that we found with parenthood, but not only us, also other studies. So experiencing more frequent positive emotions and experiencing less loneliness, those are stronger for men, or even in our study regarding loneliness only found in men. And the negative effects, such as lower mental health, more frequent negative emotions, they were stronger in women. And yeah, again, this is not just what we found. This is also what has been shown in other studies. For instance, there's one study published in 2023 by Bauer and colleagues who used cross-national data from several European countries and also focused on late adulthood, and they found positive effects of parenthood on physical health, but again, just for men, not for women.
Interesting.
Yeah, and
not surprising, can I say? Does that make me sound really skeptical? Like,
yeah, no, not surprising.
The number of women on the fence who've said to me, if I could choose fatherhood, I would choose it in an instant.
Yes. Yeah, it resonates with me, definitely.
Okay. We'll have to, interesting.
One explanation is that motherhood elevates the individual poverty risk of a woman significantly, whereas parenthood doesn't affect the individual poverty risk of men, according to a study that was published last year. And a good education in some of the countries, including, for instance, Austria, has been shown that it's not necessarily a protective factor. So even if you're a well-educated woman, motherhood significantly increases your individual poverty risk.
Interesting.
Because of course,
that was my question. Why?
Because most women do shoulder the disproportionate burden of unpaid care work and emotional labor. And I think this, for a lot of couples, because we also see in studies that couples who hold very egalitarian values, once they have children, they drift into like stereotypical roles. Yeah. And this can just be a very economically rational decision, because if we assume that both partners have the same education, they work in the same field, they work the exact same jobs, which we know often is not the case. So women tend to work in fields that are not paid as well. But even if we assume that on average, the male partner is 3 years older than the female partner, so he has 3 years more, like he has a degree more, he has more work experience, which often then translates to a higher salary, and then it's a logical decision for this couple that the woman takes more time off or reduces her working hours. It's a totally rational decision, but then you start going down this path that increases the difference in earnings between the two.
Okay. So you were sharing with regards to these gender differences, another thing you mentioned was like additional burden of care. And so, I mean, that kind of ties into this piece around earnings and like greater propensity for poverty. Is there anything else that you think, like gender wise? I mean, maybe you can talk about the loneliness piece, because that was something that you saw as far as a difference.
So yes, a lot of research shows that, but there's also qualitative research showing that women do experience intense feelings of loneliness when they are young mothers. So for instance, when they are, like, I think in this particular, it was a qualitative study, women often expressed loneliness when they were breastfeeding their child and they were in a social situation where they felt it was not like, where they felt they had to like go away from where I think this is also still like norms towards breastfeeding are luckily also changing. But in the studies, young mothers expressed intense feelings of loneliness also because they are with their child the whole time. They may lack companionship from adults. No, that's what I've also heard a lot. Whereas fathers, they tend to work. They still tend to work. So they meet their colleagues. They're meeting other people. Whereas women are spend a lot of time just with their kid.
I'm interested, and so of course I don't have kids. I live in Germany like you do. I have friends who are moms and parents, and this is a little bit, again, anecdotal. We can, unless we're a researcher like you, we can all just sort of speak from our experience. But I do think perhaps some gender norms and expectations around parental roles, specifically, I've heard, for example, from expat friends that there seems to be additional pressure to stay home more often or for longer periods of time, i.e. to do part-time work or to take longer maternity leave, which of course we have, I would say globally, fantastic parental maternity and paternity leave policies. But I have heard, and again, this is just speaking from a few people's experience, but sort of different attitudes than you might see, let's say, from Canada or the States, that towards mothers working outside the home. Now, without necessarily steering the conversation in that direction, again, that's just referencing a few people I know. I am interested, how much do you think that this study you've done looking specifically at people within Germany can be extrapolated to other countries?
There are several studies that find similar results with regard to this general comparison of people with and without children regarding life satisfaction, well-being, for instance. And these studies mainly find no differences. So these are from other Central European and Northern European countries, from the US, from Canada, also from Mexico and China. There are some cross-national studies, and those show that pro-natalist values and policies play a role. So some studies that find positive effects of parenthood tend to be conducted in countries with very strong pro-natalist values and policies, such as Hungary. And another factor in these cross-national studies is what do the family policies look like?
Yeah.
So, for instance, there tend to be more studies from the Scandinavian countries that find positive effects, some positive effects of parenthood.
Yeah. I was a little bit surprised to read that. And the reason why, and I guess maybe you can clarify, would you say pronatalist ideologies or pronatalist where like the policy actually supports people having children? Because you look at, for example,
ideologies.
Okay, yeah. Because you look at, for example, in the US, I would say right now there's like a huge movement towards, even more than ever before, pronatalist thinking that everyone should have 1 million children and all women should be vehicles for having kids. And yet, of course, when you look at policies to support that, it's not there, right? Which is driving a lot of people, I think, away from having children. So it's when policies are in line with that line of thinking. Yeah. I'm interested. So, what you're sharing with us today, both from your own research as well as, and I appreciate you referencing some of your colleagues and other studies. It creates, I think, quite a robust sort of case for the fact that, for the most part, yes, there are, of course, certain differences we see amongst having and not having kids, but this is not probably going to be a deal breaker for your life satisfaction overall. Why do you think, despite there being such a wealth of empirical evidence to the contrary, that there's so many ideas about parenthood that exist, like you're not going to be fulfilled if you don't have kids, you're going to be lonely if you don't have kids? Why do you think there's such a divide between these two things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I asked a similar question to the audience when I presented this paper in a seminar series, and the first answer I got was whether I had ever looked at a child before, because they're obviously the cutest creatures. So I don't know. So there, one answer was evolution, biology, and obviously also these pronatalist values, ideologies that we've talked about before. But I just checked this yesterday, actually. So there seems to be a change in that perception, at least in younger generations. So in the sub, there's also youth questionnaire. So young people are also surveyed. Those are 16 and 17-year-olds. And since 2018, there has been a question asking these young people, do you think it is necessary to have own children to be happy? And in 2018, 29% agreed that it is necessary to have children to be happy, and only 7% said that one can even be happier without children, and 43% said that one can be equally happy. With and without, and 21% weren't sure. And in 2022, that's the latest wave that's available. So only 4 years, and a pandemic and a war. Of course, these are also factors that go into this. But only 4 years later, only 17% agreed that one can truly be happy with children. And 18%, so a little more even, said that one can even be happier without children. And 52 said one can be equally happy, and 13%, so also less people were unsure.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's definitely shifting attitudes. If anything, I'm seeing kind of what I call a pendulum swing, where we've really romanticized and glorified parenthood. I don't want to say unreasonably so. And I mean, I find what a kind of snarky / cheeky response from someone to say, have you ever looked at a child? I mean, that may explain evolutionarily, if that's a word, or from a biological standpoint, why we have that urge. But it still doesn't necessarily explain why we have these ideas that are not actually founded. That being said, I think, and knowing a lot of people listening are probably in their early to mid 30s up to early 40s. I do agree. Everything I'm hearing and reading, when you look at people who are coming to the end of their teens and their 20s, very different attitudes. And to go back to this idea of the pendulum swing, if anything, there seems to be sometimes, perhaps unfairly, or maybe not, negative attitudes towards having kids. It's quite interesting to see this shift. Something that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, and I guess I feel fairly well attuned to, just doing the work that I do, but I'd love to hear it from you in your words. Is there a shift towards more and more people choosing not to have children from what you've seen in the research you've done?
I think that's a really hard to answer question, because we are just starting to make this distinction between child-free by choice and childless. So there are studies suggesting that this number of people who are child-free by choice, that this is actually quite stable, that child-free people have been there all the time. They maybe have not been as outspoken, but that this number is actually stable. But especially in Western countries, the number of people who are childless or child-free
without children
by circumstance, that this number is increasing. And it if you don't have this type of very intense longitudinal data, you can't really tell, because people are really great, luckily, at adapting to situations. And I think there was one study that found, even if people wanted children earlier, and then they don't end up having children, and you ask them later, well, are you child-free by choice? I say yes, because people are great at adapting to challenges. And if you only if you only take a very old sample of people who don't have kids, maybe the majority of them will say, yeah, well, I didn't want kids, even if they did, because that's adaptive. It's good for psychological well-being.
Yeah, super interesting. Okay. All right. So let me ask you this before we wrap things up. I am curious to know, is there anything either in your own research or other research that exists out there that you feel like would be helpful to people who are on the fence about whether or not to have kids? Anything that you feel like, myths to debunk, things they might need to know?
I mean, there's still so much one could still talk about, but I think one of the important takeaways that we've already talked about is the thing regarding loneliness, because I also heard in your workshop that this is a big concern, and like the research shows for women at least there are no differences in loneliness, and this also concerns studies that include older individuals than my study. So if it is loneliness that you're concerned about, that's you can drop the concern and should focus your resources on building your or maintaining your social network, investing in your friendships and your partners.
Yeah, good advice. Thank you. Okay, I'm sure people listening are eager to know, because we usually kick things off by talking to our guest about their own kids or child-free decision. And so, do you personally have children or not? I'm interested.
Yeah, no, I currently don't have children.
Okay. And so is that something, it sounds like when you say currently don't, you're still in, do you have clear feelings one way or the other, or still sort of on the fence about the matter?
Yeah, I think for a long time, this was not on my radar at all. Yeah. I just didn't think about it. But I guess I always thought I would have kids. Mm-hmm. But I didn't consciously think about it. And recently, my partner's grandma, who has also been interested in my work and who is generally a very smart lady, she asked me whether my research influenced. I think she didn't even say my decision, but something like, "Does your research influence your private life?" And at the time I said, "Well, no, of course not." But it does to some degree, definitely. I had a more positive view on parenthood before I started doing research in this field, and also, the academic career is also not super child friendly. But on the other hand, I recently learned that one of my good friends is pregnant, and there is research showing that pregnancy is contagious. But the paper is actually called "Pregnancy is Contagious."
Really?
Yeah. So we'll see if it spreads to me.
Okay, interesting. Dun, dun, dun. We'll have to talk further maybe in a few years' time and see what's been decided or happen. Okay, super interesting. And your partner's grandma sounds like a super cool lady. That's very cool. She has interest in your work and is thinking about these things. So, okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. We're not going to do rapid fire questions because, Laura's on the fence between these two decisions. So we're not going to put her on the spot right now. You've already shared such a wealth of knowledge with us. Is it okay? Will we be able to maybe link to these papers that we reference in the show notes? Okay, awesome. And if people want to connect with you, if they have further questions, or if they're just interested to reach out and thank you for this conversation, how can they best do that?
Via email or on LinkedIn. I'm also on Blue Sky.
Perfect. Okay. I've been wondering about Blue Sky, so you're going to have to debrief me on that and how it's going. Okay. We will include Laura's details in the show notes from today's episode, along with the research papers, in case you're feeling, I don't want to say nerdy, unless you're feeling really smart and want to delve in. I told Dr. Laura, now I did an undergraduate degree in psychology, and let me tell you that the really statistics specifically as a course was the bane of my existence. So digging into her papers was both insightful, interesting, and also a little bit traumatic for me. It brought up some old feelings. It's like, oh my gosh. But it is interesting if you want to delve into it further. So we will make sure to include that for any of you who are inclined towards, the finer points of Laura's research. So thank you so much for coming on today, Dr. Buchinger. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and look forward to continuing to connect with you and hearing what's next in your research.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right, before I say a final farewell, I just want to let you know that I have a bunch of free resources over at kidsorchildfree.com that you can download to check out. We've got a Kids or Child Free book guide with a whole bunch of fiction and nonfiction books to help you navigate your kids or child free decision with different perspectives, different stories that are hopefully going to help you shed some light on whether to have kids or stay child free. We also have a response guide, which is perfect for those of you who are grappling with nosy questions, people asking you so when are you going to have kids? Or what do you mean you don't want kids? I've got different scripts you can follow in terms of how to answer those questions. I also even have a little secret podcast episode, a solo episode that I recorded after a difficult conversation with a friend, really about how this kids or child-free decision, this whole conversation of should I have kids or not, can be very emotional and triggering oftentimes. So if you want to check out those and a bunch of others free resources that I have, head over to kidsorchildfree.com. I will include the link in the show notes for today's episode, and you can start downloading some of those resources to check out to help you with your decision.